Welcome to our Detection Dispatch series for our 19th episode, our hub for all things detection engineering. My name is Alex Hurtado. I will be your new host, picking up this series, this community where you can come here and get the scoop for all types of insightful discussions, hot topics, the burning questions of the field, which is a very exciting industry and field to be in, really. So today I am very thrilled to be joined by a very special guest and third time guest on the show.
Second time,
Monte,
second time.
second time guest on the show, and also the guy that we named our co-pilot or AI chatbot after, Michael Monte.
Yeah. So just brief introduction to myself. I'm Mike Monte. I'm the Senior Director of Security Field Engineering here at Anvilogic. As we talk about cloud security, navigating the effective detections of cloud, my previous role was the Global Cloud SOC Manager at JPMorgan Chase. So have a lot of experience with starting the detection lifecycle at a large bank, right? So the cloud world in 2016 was new to everybody, especially from a field perspective, and being able to understand what's the right detections to deploy. What are the things how to approach detection engineering in the cloud really is what we'll be looking to talk about today. So nice to meet you all, and looking forward to the conversation.
Very excited for this discussion, Monte, because what we found is that actually most cloud detections don't actually work. This cloud security, the cloud detections that come with our cloud security providers just aren't cutting it. And that, listeners, is why you should be listening, because this Invictus IR study recently reported by a couple different threat researchers carried out a test, 32 well-known attacks in AWS, all leaving traces of cloud trail, right? And despite having all of the evidence for these attacks, it resulted actually that none of them were reported. Guard duty only triggered just 3 out of the simulated attacks, right? Which is very limited, very eye-opening, especially because a lot of these attacks that were done, if you go take a look at the study, they're very well-known types of attacks, right? The AWS threat detection, no-show, some of the Sigma Florian Roth's baby project only detected 11 out of 32, so less than a third of these attacks. So if you haven't checked out this article, definitely check it out. So Monte, what I want to do is let's cover some concepts around navigating, effective cloud detection, right, in cloud environments. And you said it yourself, right? You're a seasoned DE, right? You build an entire SOC at a large institution. You probably cooked up hundreds of these cloud detections, and you're doing it every day for our customers. And so when we think about cloud security, right, it's a whole different game, right? Compared to the traditional setup, right? We're not using malware to break in really anymore. Maybe you're using a leaked access key and you're just logging in legitimately, right? So the environment changes, the threat landscape changes, and of course the detection methods also change. So Monte, what would you say? What is considered a good cloud security detection? How do you know that it's good? Because what's not good are these out of the box, cloud stuff.
Absolutely. It's a really good question, and it's a challenging one to answer, to be honest. What is a good detection for cloud? Cloud is a lot of misconfigurations, to be honest with you, right? It's how you build a preventative cloud environment with automation to ensure that there are guardrails for things that shouldn't be open. For example, if you have an S3 bucket open to the public, you definitely don't want to be storing PII data in there, for example. How do you know a good cloud detection is that it's really understanding your architecture, right? And piecing together multiple actions together to drive higher fidelity use cases. A common example of that is AWS IAM user privilege escalation, right? IAM user privilege escalation is usually happening through multiple actions, right? Somebody
Yeah.
creates an IAM policy, for example. That IAM policy is then attached to a user. That IAM policy may have admin privileges. And
Yeah.
then following that, the user may actually create an access key for persistence, right? Those are 3 CloudTrail events. You can create detections in and of itself. You can create an attach IAM role policy. You can create a creation of an IAM role policy, and you can create a rule for create access key. those three individual detections will be noisy, right? There are going
Yeah.
to be SRE teams, there are going to be administrators that are allowed to conduct this activity. So in and of itself, it's sort of difficult to decipher what's the norm versus what is adversarial. But being able to piece these detections together in sort of a detection that is sequentially sort of indicative of an attack pattern is definitely something that you want to look for and look in doing in cloud environments, delivering some more context, some more enrichment to a SOC analyst that's actually reviewing this.
Yeah, no, I really like what you said. I want to touch in on that because as obviously attack surfaces are expanding right now across more than even one cloud sometimes, when you're launching a bunch of these, atomic singular based detections, they can get quite noisy. And so that gets me thinking like, about being resource conscious, really, when we talk about the quality of a good detection, right, that you deploy. Would you agree that, should we be making these detections general enough to cover, more than one scenario, maybe five, six different scenarios at a time? Because too granular of things to me sounds like a very high resource consumption. So how did you navigate this complexity?
It's a good question, right? In order to combine use cases together into, the same security detection, they need to make sense. So and another example of this is, yeah, how you can leverage the KMS service in AWS to encrypt your data. Normally used
Mm.
encryption is good, right? But an adversary can encrypt your data and delete the key, for example.
Yeah.
Um, so it's how you're piecing together the detections indicative of an attack path. For example, if I was to just say I have an IAM use case and I'm looking for different security detections associated to IAM, well, great, but that makes it harder for an analyst that's triaging that particular IAM use case to
Mm.
understand what am I actually looking at here. Am I actually looking at privilege escalation because of a policy that was created with the administrative privileges?
Mm.
Or am I looking for an unauthorized user being created? Right. So they need to make sense if you're actually piecing together the detections. You can't just simply say, I have an IAM use case looking at six different security use cases or misconfigurations for that matter. Rather piecing together things that make sense in an attack pattern or what an adversary would actually do in an environment
Mm.
definitely makes more sense, right? So when you're thinking about your detections, I would certainly kind of look at what are things that adversaries would do following sort of a step-by-step path? Leverage your CloudTrail, you leverage your Azure activity logs, leverage your equivalent in GCP to kind of build those detections, not
Mm-hmm.
strictly kind of build service-based detections that are kind of correlating multiple use cases together, because that will certainly drive confusion from a
Mm.
SOC perspective.
No, definitely makes sense. So when you think back on how you got started, right, for a lot of our DEs that are, wanting to kick off these critical, cloud security detections, would is there any like jumpstart ones that you recommend? Any favorite ones that would really help them jumpstart that effort if we want to like talk about some specific use cases right now?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, and the way that I would kind of look at it is understanding your architecture, right?
Yeah.
This is a perfect slide that you have on, right? Because it's not just the cloud; it's actually how you're integrated to it, right? So
Yeah.
most environments are hybrid, right? There are still servers on premise. There are still means of connecting into the cloud environment. So when you think about, how you jumpstart your detections, you want to look for the most easiest ways to access the environment,
Mm.
and look for detections in that area, right? You talked a little bit about CloudTrail being, looking at the different feeds and, what sort of data feeds are successful and unsuccessful in determining detections. Cloud is not just CloudTrail. A lot of people just think that, API monitoring is enough.
Mhm.
But when you think about a cloud environment, right, you think about the entire architecture. It's a whole network, right? So you have network-based logs,
Sure.
you have, asset and identity information that's very ephemeral, right? So that's very important to kind of keep track of. And the best approach when you're sort of starting your detections is to sort of threat model your environment, not just the cloud, but also how you're integrated to it, and sort of identify ways that you can build detections that are kind of your most weak points, right? Or what are your access points into it, and how you're going to actually build detections around that.
Definitely. That by modeling, that makes me think of MITRE. That makes
Yes.
me think of
Yeah.
MITRE, and I want to touch on that. But before we get into MITRE, um, did you find, with this CloudWatch trails and everything that all the evidence that could have allowed for discovery of a lot of these attacks was there. It was trailed. It was just a matter of, did they have the detection? Did you have a detection for it? And that it really wasn't there. So with that, did you find that you have, visibility and clarity that you want from these providers, right? With the cloud trails that you're working with, because it's not always feasible to control all of the ingress, all the egress, right, from a single place. It's just not realistic, even in the cloud world. So, with did the cloud service providers, do you have all of the data, the telemetry that you need to understand what's happening so you can cook up these cloud detections usually?
Theoretically, yes, but there's some trickery around it. For example, object level logging for S3, that is an option to turn on, right? So if
Mhm.
you're looking to identify, adversaries actually touching your files within S3 buckets, that is
Yeah,
something that you need to turn on. And the challenge with that is this your size of data, right? When you're thinking about in standing up an environment, right, like such as cloud, you're now thinking about seven, 10 different data feeds that need to be onboarded into your SIM or your data repository. My experience was, we started with some data, we realized that we needed more data than
I
just
need more.
CloudTrail. The data is there. It's whether you can fit it into your SIM so that you can build the necessary detections around it. I would be conscious of that, right? Turning on CloudTrail is an option. Obviously, that's a great place to start, but make sure you're turning on object level logging. Make sure that your engineering folks are in awareness of, the amount of data that you're going to, consume in your data repository, and whether that's something that's a part of their budget, right?
Mhm.
So the data is there, right? The data can be there. It's the matter of fitting it in, right? And where you can fit it. The last thing that you do want is dark data. It not only impacts the detections, but how you're able to investigate, adversarial activity within your cloud environments.
Whether you can fit it in and whether we can afford to fit it in. It would be so great to have everything, right? But it's sometimes we have to make decisions, which feeds are more important in terms of priority, because that's what the budget we have.
Exactly that.
Let's touch back on MITRE. Did you find that modeling your detections, you're using, the MITRE framework as your Northern Star? Sometimes in a really great blog post that Omar Singer, our evangelist, just came out with, is that a lot of organizations are, very caught up sometimes in playing MITRE bingo, too laser focused on making sure they cover every single bingo shape there, and ensure that they have every tactic, but they start to lose the relevance on some of them, right? Like the most trivial example that I can think of is, like, there's some threats that, inserting a removable media, obviously not a threat you have to worry about in the cloud, right? So,
Right.
so playing MITRE bingo, it's not about if you cover the tactic, right? It's about how you're doing it. So did you find you're using MITRE, and how did you do it?
Yeah, so there is a cloud matrix, right? The cloud matrix is a subcomponent of, the entire MITRE matrix. However, there's a couple things here, right? You can cover a particular technique with a detection that may not be the only technique or, means or use case tied to that particular technique. So if you
Right.
are playing MITRE bingo, right, and you're covering your techniques, based upon one security use case, you kind of get left in the dust in the terms of other means of, leveraging that technique in order to sort of compromise an organization, right? So you definitely
Yeah.
want to be kind of, have the mindset of, one detection or one use cases may not necessarily be enough for that particular technique.
Yeah.
One, common technique is valid accounts, right? Valid accounts is very broad in terms of a technique that, is within the MITRE cloud matrix, but valid accounts is covering a lot of things, right? You can have different security use cases looking at, creation of unauthorized access users, but you could also kind of you're then missing some other use cases tied to roles, tied
Mhm.
to other means of, AD. and how your AD environment is actually set up with your cloud environment. So I would be cognizant of leveraging the matrix as a means of guidance, but also sort of tying that into understanding that there's different means of leveraging that technique from a or an adversarial perspective. So I would keep that mindset as well, and instead of just kind of playing minor bingo. The other thing around this is looking back at our architecture slide here. Cloud Matrix is really just focused on cloud, right? It doesn't actually kind of focus in on the means of actually connecting to it, right? And everybody's
Oh,
means of connecting to it is typically different, right?
yeah.
So you kind of need to be conscious of your access points and how you're integrated to your cloud environment from your on-premise instance, if you are a hybrid environment for that matter.
Well, that has all to do with what Anton Chevakin calls the juicy part of cloud security, like this IAM world, right? There's this realm where there's people think that maybe proactive hardening of your IAM roles and ensuring that the right roles and the right people have the right access to the right set of assets, and maybe focusing a lot more on that versus the reactive kind of detection engineering stance, which I mean, it's never a bad thing to be really good at IAM hardening, but it's just there's got to be a balance, right?
Absolutely. There must be a balance, and there must be an understanding from the SOC too, right? You're
Hmm.
going to have elevated privilege roles, right? You're going to need to understand, what is approved and what's not, right? And it even goes to the services within these cloud environments. What are they author? What are the services that are authorized to be leveraged via these roles and user environments, and what services are not, right? A common thing that happens is Bitcoin mining in environments, and spinning up of services that cost you dollars, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, are those authorized or not? And do you have preventative controls to make sure that they can't be leveraged? If not, are you monitoring those services being leveraged for that matter?
Absolutely. I want to touch back on what you said about, the singular detection versus multidimensional detection. Um, it- that's often at the design tooling will really dictate whether you can merge a lot of these sources together. So what are some ways, that you're able to effectively do that?
Yeah, so that typically is done in your sim, right? I think that
Yeah.
being able to um, have an approach around running detections, storing them in some sort of summary index for further correlation, right? So I usually think about detection as behaviors that you're collecting, right? You're collecting behaviors in some sort of alert lake or
Yeah.
a summary index where you can then build correlation with the underlying detections that are detecting the misconfigurations, right? So I'll go back to my IAM privilege use case, right? These are three different actions, right? You have your creation of an IAM role with elevated privileges, the attachment of that privilege, which is the second stage, to a user, and then the remaining of persistence via a creation of an access key. Those three detections need to be kind of assimilated into a central location. That central location can be an alert lake. That central location can be a summary index. Then
Mhm.
your sort of second layer detection that's correlating those three objects together is done through that alert lake, right? It's done through that detection that has been collected, hopefully tagged, normalized, and enriched, and
Mhm.
stored in a central location so that you can do the necessary correlation to drive a high fidelity use case to the SOC.
I pulled up this other these are other domains that really highlight that, showing the many different types of telemetry that you have to pull for these multidimensional, all of which you touched on, which is good. The only thing is I find it hard to find threat research out there for cloud security. Is that what you're seeing too?
Yeah,
For like
so
for some of these specific use cases, like
really good question. Yeah, so
yeah.
threat research in the cloud is coming along, I would say. The one thing that I would say is the shared responsibility model between your cloud provider and the organization makes it hard for threat research to be published, right? There's a lot of things that are kept hush hush from a cloud
Mm,
provider environment perspective. So I'd say it's maturing, right? And I think it's heading in the right direction, but as we sort of mature from a security perspective on how to detect things in the cloud, threat research kind of falls in line with that. Um, you know, uh, I would say that it's not as mature as you're sort of some of the things that you're expecting on endpoints or from your threat
Oh
groups
yeah.
coming
Oh
from
yeah.
on premise.
Endpoint, there's so much content out there for endpoint, like with Nasreddin and Florian Roth. I mean, most of the things you do find, most of these Sigma rules are endpoint based.
Yeah, yeah. So
Mhm.
it just becomes more challenging, right? And again, it's kind of driven around the misconfiguration kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
It's your responsibility and the cloud provider's responsibility to sort of ensure that you're configured correctly. Based upon it being configuration based, there's not much threat research around that because it's not malware based, right? It's more so
Right.
configuration based.
Right. And of course, in the situation of a leaked access key, at that point it's no malware is involved. You're just logging
Yeah,
in normally at that point. And it's the
exactly.
behavior after that is what determines, what is legitimate versus what is not. But for like, I don't know, like use cases like Kubernetes and containers, like I have yet to see anything on things like that. Have you?
No, no, it's definitely not. It's
How do we
it's
approach container cloud security?
Yeah, I mean that's a whole nother ball game in cloud, right? So
Uh-huh.
now you're looking at so this is a great slide because you're kind of showing seven different sort of data feeds, right? But that seventh data feed being Kubernetes is actually four or five more data feeds that you actually need to put together, right? So when you're looking at Kubernetes environments, you're now looking at your control plane logs, your audit logs, you're looking at your OS level logs for containers, and things become much more challenging. One, because an investigative standpoint, there's a lot of traceability aspect to it, right? Say
Yeah.
I have a public facing application that's running on a container.
Hmm.
How do I actually trace the traffic from an exploit that it may have occurred and broke out of my container? Right now, you're looking through VPC full logs. Now you're looking through gateway logs, all the way down to the container. It makes it extremely challenging without traceability or trace
Sure.
IDs in order to understand where that data is. So those logs are very imperative when you talk about containers. But also the how ephemeral containers are and IP addresses kind of switching so often in that environment, is very challenging, right? So making sure that
Completely.
you're staying on top of assets and identities is something that's very crucial. So that you're understanding, from a traceability standpoint, at this point in time, in this 8 seconds that this container lived, the IP address of this container was X. So certainly something that's important and something to think about when you're building detections around containers, right? Control plane and also OS level logging on the containers itself.
Yeah, as ephemeral as their nature is, I'm comforted with the fact that, the network, right? The network doesn't lie. You cannot tamper with, you cannot change, you cannot turn off logging for what the network reports when communication is sent from something to another. So if we are, looking at that and we are collecting that and we are stitching together that analysis, and I'm comforted with the fact that you can apply detection on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Beaconing to
Mhm.
beaconing, and you'll always find that whether that's on premise or in cloud.
Exactly. So with that, there's this concept of, not being so well versed in having these skill sets in the cloud. And if you were to rebuild, your security operations center again, and you're trying to onboard a bunch of new people, there's always like, this two different types of personas. There's always someone who just has that kind of curiosity, threat hunting sort of mindset, or there's someone also that persona that maybe is very well versed in the cloud, right? Maybe they spent the last 4 years of his or her career getting ramped up on a lot of these cloud certifications, AWS certifications, Azure certifications. Would you find like you have a preference for someone who is well versed in cloud to do your security, or would you say someone who just has kind of this DE threat hunting mindset? Would you
Yeah, good
say?
question. That's definitely going to be a biased question because I came from the security practitioner background.
Mhm.
So I'm going to go with security practitioner. But the reason behind that is at the end of the day, an environment's an environment, and I'd rather have somebody on my team that's well versed in understanding threat hunting, understanding how to build detections, that versus somebody that is an understanding of how cloud works without any security mindset or background there.
Yeah.
Um, but again, right, I come from a background of being knowing nothing in the cloud and kind of get thrown into a position to figure it out. And I think that it's possible, certainly. And what I would have somebody with a security mindset do is go get those cloud certifications so that they are well
Definitely
versed.
do it.
But still having that underlying SOC background as a primary, I think is crucial, right? Understanding how threats work, understanding how to triage them, and obviously always when building detections, you want to understand the other side of it, right? How do our IR team is it enough information for our IR team to build a story around that particular threat or adversarial attack?
Yeah, I find that you can teach, cloud certifications. Obviously, there's, whole curriculums and courses on them, but you can't really teach someone to have this curiosity, way
Yeah.
of they either have it or they don't. And even with these cloud certifications, I mean, when I find that when I'm integrating something and I did it like a year ago and I'm trying to do the same thing again on another environment, like already it's already different.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Every
Like,
environment is entirely different in and of itself. So even to get trained up to be, that threat hunter in an environment takes some time to understand, where your security posture and your environment as a whole.
so, besides its certifications, is there anything we can recommend to our listeners to strengthen their skill sets in cybersecurity for
Yeah,
cloud?
absolutely. So I'll kind of just a lessons learned, I would say, is
Yeah,
training. You may be a leader in trying to build up your sort of detection program for cloud, but you're at the end of the day, right? You're turning over those detections to SOC analysts, right? So means of training them on cloud and training them on what these detections mean specific to your environment. Again, there's many different ways to spin up a cloud environment. There's transitive gateways. There's multi-account management that can really help in sort of being able to teach analysts how to triage. Right. So, my number one thing that, I'll go back to is more training for SOC analysts. I would highly recommend that to, anybody that's, building detections is, having face-to-face, training sessions with your cloud folks, your SRE folks that are building the cloud environments themselves and the
yeah,
SOC, and continuously kind of meeting to understand what are the architecture changes that are happening, what are the services that are being approved in these cloud environments for people to leverage. And that maintaining of knowledge needs to be sort of carried in documentation as well, so that your SOC analysts and net new SOC analysts that do come into the environment, have a place to go for reference, right, for context around some of these alerts that come into place. As a new detection engineer or as somebody that's actually keen on learning more about cloud is, the best way to learn is actually hands-on keyboard, right? Spin up your own lab
yeah,
environment. Store your own CloudTrail events. Start to conduct activities yourself from an adversarial perspective. Identify the CloudTrail events that are actually occurring as a result. That's the best way to learn, and I think that no matter what environment it is, whether it's cloud or endpoint, that's definitely my recommendation.
absolutely. Really, really great insights there. I also wanted to point the listeners to the Armory. We have an open source GitHub repository of detections that the Armory produces for all sorts of cloud detections that they can use in all of and very fluent across all of the different clouds, which you can definitely take a look at. But the only thing that I would add to this is that it's with such a remote workforce right now that we've, post COVID world that we've been into, that we, jumped into, it's not the same, right? That you're not sitting side by side some of those senior analysts where you can just look over their shoulder, really quickly ask some questions, really quickly work on something really sophisticated together. And which is in a way doesn't make sense because we are in tech and we are, we're supposed to be connected, but it's not the same kind of experience, right? Instead of having, your level three right next to you and learning from them, right? But we're getting there. Um, there are resources out there, and then definitely, listening to podcasts like these, like the Google, cloud security podcast, things like that is what I find is probably the best insightful discussions is how I did it really over the years. We are almost at the top of the hour here. I want to open it up for anyone that has any questions for Monte, and if not, we can have a little chat.
I got a question for you, Monty.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tim.
Make it interesting. So this one's more of an opinion question since you've done a lot of this stuff. I'm just really curious of your opinion here. So you talked about at the top of the podcast with AWS guard duty and Sigma detections and these others. Like, why is it that cloud providers haven't been able to do a better job, like with guard duty and other these things? Like, why haven't they figured it out? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
It's good. It's a really good question, and I think it goes back to the configuration aspect, right? The cloud providers don't know how you integrated your cloud environment yourself, right? They don't understand your guardrails, and they don't understand where your preventive controls live, right? So they can tell you as much as they want. They can say that, hey, you have an unauthorized access user, but is it intentional or not, right? Are people allowed to access your cloud environment externally? What is that subnet, right? The cloud providers are not necessarily in awareness of that, which makes it challenging, right? That's where we step in, right? We as detection engineers, need to be able to understand, what's allowed versus what's not, and that's where I see most things fail, right? You see a lot of noise from guard duty sometimes because they're kind of alerting on things that they think is suspicious, but they're not attributing it to your environment so much.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The specific configuration and the way things are set up and architected has such a big impact on
Absolutely.
what you should or shouldn't be looking for when it comes to security. So no, it's a great point.
And for those who didn't catch last week's episode was on the security aha moments that Tim Frazier and Omar Singer covered. Really, really interesting points on the benefits of data lakes, those aha moments. Definitely be sure to check that out. On that episode, Monte, Tim started the episode with a dad joke.
I don't have dad jokes, unfortunately, but I'm working on it.
You should start taking notes because you will be
coming. So dad jokes, need to be taught. I'll be asking Tim for those.
I gotta ask because in my house we're Monty Python fans, and it's a kind of humor that doesn't have like a punchline like a dad joke. Are you guys fans of that?
Not so much myself.
So if we don't have any questions, we happy to give you guys all the time back. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode on talking about the latest in navigating cloud detections. Our next episode, stay tuned for some very, very exciting guests that we're going to be having on the show, such as Andrew Van Vliet and a couple other exciting folks in the space. So thank you guys all for joining. Thank you, Monte, for an incredible discussion. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Tim. Everyone, be sure to check out the links I posted in the chat for some cloud security detections provided by The Forge. And I'll see you all in 2 weeks.